Hi, I'm Dr. Natalie Sambhi, Senior Policy Fellow with Asia Society Australia and founder and executive director of Verve Research, an independent think tank focused on Southeast Asian foreign policy and defense affairs. Dr. Big Chung and I are marking the launch of a new report published by Asia Society Australia, which places Southeast Asian agency at the center of analysis on US-China armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific. We examined 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam, looking at domestic factors, geopolitical considerations, economic dependencies, and social factors when trying to understand how these states and their leaders would be thinking about potential conflict in the region. The following conversation with Minh Phuong Vu from the Australian National University digs deeper into one of those case studies, Vietnam, and we hope you enjoy a deeper dive into Hanoi's strategic considerations. I'm pleased to be joined by Minh Phuong Vu from the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, where she's a scholar currently on Vietnam's foreign policy. She's also been an associate with the Australian Institute of International Affairs National Branch here in Canberra. But we're here to discuss the latest findings of our report on maritime Southeast Asia's decision-making amidst US-China armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Minh, thank you so much for joining me. Could you tell our audience a little bit about your background and your interests concerning your doctoral studies in Vietnam?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently undertaking my PhD research at the ANU Coral School Department of International Relations, where I conduct a long-term study into Vietnam's foreign policy and the evolution of its national interests from 1975 until 2025. So looking at a 50 years period and focusing on particularly, prominent debates among elites about, perception of national interests and key issues such as, the collapse of the Soviet Union or the rise of China, and sort of shape, my studies around these key moments of crises.
With that in mind, with that historical context, when you think of Vietnam's leaders today, particularly the Communist Party of Vietnam, when they look at the Indo-Pacific in particular, what are their major security concerns? And are they really thinking about US-China armed conflict?
Yeah, I think that had you asked this questions 5 or 7 years ago, the answer might be different. It might veer towards more, Southeast Asian leaders or Vietnamese leaders doesn't think that much about US-China conflict or geopolitics in or greater geopolitics in that sense, but perhaps more about their domestic issues and domestic politics. Um, but I think that has changed, and I think that forefront in leaders' mind right now is probably issues of geopolitics and U.S.-China conflict would be high on the list as a dimension of that, because I think now there is an increasing awareness that is sustaining economic growth, which links to party legitimacy, and addressing other domestic issues are inherently intertwined with geopolitics and are affected by great power competition and potentially great power conflict. I think COVID has really showed this. So since 2020, we were shown that the sort of globalized economic order that once benefited Vietnam, benefited Southeast Asian economy, is the engine behind their prosperity. Is also this interconnectedness is also a source of vulnerability. Um, and we're once again reminded of that with the recent U.S.-Iran conflict and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And this was expressed quite outwardly in I think most recently in Dolam address in the Shangri-La dialogue, where he identified interconnectedness as as a vulnerability and a strategic vulnerability of that. And, the competition between great powers as a major source of crisis for security in his country. So I think that, now U.S.-China conflict is very high on the list for Vietnamese leaders. And there is, sort of a sense of a hope that this conflict would this competition perhaps inevitable but would be able to be managed or play out in a rather healthy manageable ways that doesn't damage Vietnamese economies or its stability too much.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
you pointed to exactly like the aim of our report, which is to dig down and look at domestically from the perspective of each of the Southeast Asian countries that we studied, the five of them. How is it that these leaders are looking at the problem? So what you've outlined just now is that there's an economic dimension, in particular, that's linked to regime survival. Now, that consideration is not necessarily the case in other Southeast Asian countries. For our audience's sake, are there other considerations, other factors that would be at play if there were in the process of conflict decision making, so you see the economy, which then also links into regime survival and legitimacy. Are there other factors? Is there anything in the report that you want to highlight or things that you think we missed out?
Yeah, so I think the factors that you and Big have assessed in the report, namely relationship with China and the US, decision makers and the decision making process, and as well as strategic constraints and a couple of other factors. I think those come together nicely to create, a very solid and a key building block for Vietnam's conflict decision making.
When it comes to China, if we're
Yeah,
looking specifically, what
yeah.
is it that Vietnam's leaders think about if a conflict breaks out? How will that play out with its relationship with China?
Yeah, so I guess that's, sort of the point that I was going to get at. It is a little bit controversial to say perhaps but I do believe that relationship with China would be, top of the list, when it comes to when it comes to factors that would shape Vietnam's conflict decision making. I think, you pointed out very clearly in the report that Vietnam's is very dependent on China for trade. 40% of its imports, raw material imports, are supplied by China. It shares a border with China and a very long history of being in and out of conflict with this much more powerful neighbor, and there is an acute awareness that China is indeed way more powerful than the last time that Vietnam has ever been in a direct conflict with it in 1979, when the two had a brief border war. China's military capability has increased quite a lot, exponentially since then. Um, so I do think that relations with China would be on the forefront of Vietnam's leaders' mind when it comes to a scenario of conflict, and they would, I think that every move or every decision that Vietnam's make, of course, it would have its national interests first and foremost as sort of the key. As sort of the grounding principle, but it would also look for up to the north and sort of anticipate what the reaction from the leaders in Beijing might be.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that came out during our interviews when Bick and I traveled to Hanoi is that embedded in Vietnam's strategic culture is, as you said, that Vietnam has fought and also succeeded against China in the past, against four of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. That's got to do, incredible things to its sense of national resilience. Do you think that that could be a factor in conflict decision making today? Or as you say, has time moved on, that's changed the conditions of what future conflict might look like?
So I guess I have always been a proponent that, a supporter of the idea that, that history and lessons of history play a major part in, how countries interpret their surrounding environment and their own interests. Um, so I'll like to say that yes, nationalism and national pride, that derives from these glorious, battles or victories against, powerful nations, is always in, Vietnam's sort of DNA and how it conduct itself internationally. But I think, looking more broadly over the past, 20 years or so, ever since Vietnam's foreign policy reform in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I think there's been more of a sense of pragmatism, um, that conflict isn't what Vietnam's won, and it need a peaceful external environment for development. So, even if, Vietnam is capable of being resilient or is capable of withstanding external pressure in scenarios of conflict, I don't think that that is, an ideal scenario for it, nor it is something that, it is confident or about or what it seeks. So I think at the moment, I believe there's actually a lot of anxiety, despite Vietnam growing standing in international affairs over the past couple of decades. It might see itself, as a rising middle power. It might see itself in, a better position ever before to shape, the environment around it. But I think there's, what the main, the main brushstroke here is still that it's highly anxious about, current developments.
You mentioned just now a sense of resilience, and we know that partnerships can help provide countries with that sense of resilience as well. If Vietnam is being much more of an active middle power these days, what kind of partnerships can it pursue to help increase that sense of resilience, either leading up to a conflict or during a conflict? And of course, I'm specifically thinking about, the target audience of our report, which is Australia. But I'm also interested in your thoughts about where does the rest of Southeast Asia and ASEAN fit into Vietnam's thinking about conflict?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and important questions. I guess for this point, I do generally agree with the report's recommendation about the role that Australia can play. Um, in contributing and building toward resilience in terms of, either economics, energy, supply chains, diversification, in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. I have also, it's from my knowledge, there has been also ongoing activities, between the two countries, especially from Australia's side, to build up, strategic capabilities in Vietnam with things like English language training or strategic analysis training um, that Australia's defense offer its Vietnamese counterparts. So I think programs like that are extremely helpful. Because in a scenario of conflict, yes, sure, it is, it is the energy and it is continuous trade activities that developing countries like Vietnam and other Southeast Asia countries would most care about, and food security as well. But they also, would need, I think they would also deeply value, the assistant to help build up strategic capabilities. And strategic capability isn't just always just, in terms of weaponaries or their military capabilities, but I think human resources and human capabilities are also extremely important. I was at Shangri-La recently and had a chance to speak to some Vietnamese colleagues while I was there. And we talked about this issue for a little bit. When we were talking about, sort of the rules-based order and we sort of made the observation that Vietnam was there trying to push for, increase, increase alignment with rules and upholding of norms. But that also led us to the question of, but how do we actually know that? How do we actually do that? As far as the people in the room know, Vietnam perhaps have one reliable international law expert, and there is there is you know a lot to be done in that aspect of building resilience, not just in terms of material, but in terms of human capability as well. And I think that that's where Australia can really make an impact and contribute. But that is not the sort of work that can be played out during crisis, right? Human resources take a long time to develop. So it's the work that needs to be needs to be undertaken from afar and from now. I think if you're anticipating a crisis in the recent future.
For sure. And what about the rest of Southeast Asia? What's Vietnam's relationship like in terms of a mutually supportive partnership, either leading up to a conflict or during a conflict? And how do you see the regional grouping, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN?
Yeah, I think that Vietnam is, trying its best to become, a better neighbor to other Southeast Asian countries, and is prioritizing relationship and cooperations with countries in its immediate region who, would very likely shares a lot of its interests and be in similar position as Vietnam if and when a conflict breaks out between the two great powers. I think most recently, President Dolam has went on a tour around Asia and Southeast Asia. Notably, he has, upgrade relationship with the Philippines, who share a lot of Vietnam's, standing and interest in the South China Sea, to from a strategic partnership to an enhanced strategic partnership, and this is an upgrade that came after 10 years, I believe. And I can see that Vietnam is pouring more efforts into consolidating relationship with neighbors within its immediate region. So before that, from a couple of years ago, when it comes to upgrading relations to either strategic um, partnership or a comprehensive strategic partnership, and however many labels that it has in its back pockets. I think Vietnam tends to go, and a lot of Southeast Asian countries as well, tends to go for very strong, very capable partners. So I think that China is the first comprehensive strategic partnership that Vietnam has, and then it goes down the list, going to Russia, going to Japan, going to Australia, going to the United States. Very capable, very strong partners. But I think now of course, that since that since facilitating relation with strong partners have sort of been done to a certain degree, it's also looking towards to its immediate region. But I think a reason for that also comes from how fragmented the current world is, and with recent decoupling trends from China and the US making trade much more difficult and making the world less it is still very interconnected, but there is definitely challenges there in terms of I think there is, doubts whether that in the future this interconnectedness would be continue regardless of geopolitical issues. So I think that to enhance intra-regional connectivities um, and relationships is in a way preparing for the future and preparing for the region resilience. So if we trade more in between each other, that could help mitigate some of the economic and supply chain effects that might come with crisis in the future.
Thinking about, you talked there about interconnectedness in the lead up to conflict. A lot of analysts and Southeast Asian watchers give ASEAN a lot of flack for not being able to sort out some of the security challenges within the region, which is perhaps a too high an expectation of what the grouping was designed to do. If there were a conflict between the US and China, what kind of role do you think ASEAN would play, and how would Vietnam see that?
Yes, I think that for ASEAN, I think that at this point it is more well known for its flaws rather than, its accomplishment. Um, but I think that in a conflict scenario, it would still play an extremely important role. For in terms of collective bargaining power, as I mentioned before, I think that it is very likely that in scenarios of conflict between involving China and the U.S., whether it is a conflict in the South China Sea or Taiwan, or a direct kinetic exchange between China and the U.S. In all of those scenarios, it is very likely that Southeast Asian countries would be in very similar positions and they would be in positions that, um, that get impacted negatively by these developments. So having ASEAN as a traditional and familiar platform where countries can come together and enhance their collective bargaining power, I think is very important. I think your report also rightfully point out that ASEAN can also serve as a venues for dialogue and expression in a way that this diplomacy can help to buy time for Southeast Asia as well, right? Um, and that could help with de-escalation in a scenario of conflict. So I think that the role of ASEAN cannot be understated. And I also remember there was an exchange I had with a Vietnamese diplomat. This was during the time of the coup happening in Myanmar, and there's a lot of sort of distrust in the institution in ASEAN as a workable institution. And I remember this diplomat saying to me that ASEAN to Vietnam is like a speaker, as in it amplified, it helped Vietnam to amplify its voices and say things that it doesn't that it find difficult to say as Vietnam itself. But if posing these points as regional concerns and regional interests, it is much easier for Vietnam to communicate this point. So, for example, issues like South China Sea, if Vietnam stood up and say that Vietnam is very concerned about recent development between, China and the Philippines, it might sound, biased. But if it plays it in a regional concern lens, as it does indeed affect other Southeast Asian countries as well. Vietnam find it much more comfortable to communicate it in such a manner rather than having to stand up and say things that might antagonize one party or the other.
And finally, you've given us so many insights into how Vietnam is looking at these kinds of issues in the Indo-Pacific. Like, for instance, the idea of economic security linked to regime legitimacy, linked to a sense of vulnerability, working together with partners, deepening partnerships now, the need for developing human capital in advance. Given that our report is largely focused to a practitioner audience, primarily in Australia, but in the region as well. From your perspective, as someone who watches Vietnam very, very closely, what should practitioners know about Vietnam when they're developing engagement strategies or even policy as well? What's that final thought?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and I've been thinking about this for a bit. But I think I guess two things come to mind when it comes to advice for, partners who are seeking to engage with Vietnam strategically. I think firstly, it's important to understand that Vietnam is very foreign policy as of current is I think the word to describe it is very cautious. And Vietnam's action is often more characterized and by its inaction rather than what it says or do actively. And I think that Vietnam wants to do things on its own term, just in a way that is similar to all other Southeast Asian countries. An increasing concern, in the current dynamic is that Southeast Asia is losing its rights to choose, losing its rights to choose who it wants to partner with, what issue it wants to partner on. And losing its strategic autonomy. So I think that in engaging with Vietnam or any Southeast Asian partners, sort of honoring this autonomy would be greatly appreciated. So I think that when you're engaging with them, rather than coming with arriving with a fixed agenda of what issue you believe is most important, per se, if you think that the South China Sea is very likely to become a flashpoint. Let's work on that. Let's work on enhancing your maritime strategic capabilities. Um, I think that, why that is greatly appreciated. Maybe it's better to, have Hanoi itself come to you and tell you what issues it wants to work on with you. And then, you might be surprised by the answer, and and the answer from Hanoi, you can treat that as data in itself. You can then understand from Hanoi and from Southeast Asia's perspective what is actually important to them. So I guess that would be my perhaps first advice. My second advice is I'm not sure how applicable this is immediately, but I think understanding of history and collective memory is extremely important, especially in if you're anticipating a conflict scenario. I think that Vietnam sees itself as a country that is shaped by conflict, particularly conflicts with great power. So the lessons that it drew from, these experiences would likely inform how it approaches the next one. So if you're, so if you are doing your calculations around, how maritime Southeast Asian countries would likely respond to a conflict scenario, I think it might be a useful avenue to look into its past and see, not just what it did back then, what these countries, react or did back then, but what is the narrative um, about those action now, because I think that alignment is a big topic here when we discuss, conflict between China and US, and Vietnam has, in the past, been an ally of China, been an ally of the Soviet Union. What sort of lesson it have drew from those experience, I think is critical to shaping the policy that it currently has. Which is interestingly going in the opposite direction and not seeing much value in an alliance. I think that understanding of history and engaging with a historical perspective, it is probably would be fruitful and useful in terms of engaging with Vietnam.
Oh, that's great. Oh, those are really useful insights, very practical insights as well. Ming, thanks so much for making time to dig a little bit deeper into how Vietnam might be thinking about potential US-China armed conflict and giving us much more depth about where Hanoi is coming from. Thanks so much again for joining me.
All right. Thank you, Natalie.
Well, we hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Ming Vu. And if you'd like to read the report in full, it's available on the Asia Society Australia website. Don't forget to follow our social media channels and look out for the full recording of our launch event in Melbourne. Thanks very much.